What do you do when the woman you hired to play your girlfriend becomes the only person capable of saving everything you've built? The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office. Marcus Chen stood motionless, watching the city lights blur through the streaming water, his reflection ghostly in the glass. In his hand, a contract. On his desk, a photograph of a woman he'd met exactly once. In 48 hours, she would walk into a boardroom filled with investors who could either make him a billionaire or destroy him completely. And she had no idea who he really was. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been untouchable. His tech startup, Vantage AI, had been valued at $800 million. Venture capitalists circled him like sharks drawn to blood. His face appeared on magazine covers with headlines that used words like visionary and disruptor. At 32, he'd built an empire from nothing, transforming a college dorm room idea into a company that promised to revolutionize how corporations analyzed data. Everything he touched turned to gold. Until it didn't. The problem started with a single conversation at an investor dinner in Singapore. Marcus had been courting the Kingsley Group, a massive private equity firm known for turning promising startups into global giants. Their lead partner, William Kingsley, was old money, old school, old-fashioned. Over whiskey that cost more than most people's monthly rent, Kingsley had leaned back in his chair and asked the question that would change everything. "Tell me, Marcus, what keeps you grounded?" Marcus had rattled off the usual responses: his team, his vision, his commitment to innovation. Kingsley had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "I mean personally. Wife, family. The men I invest in aren't just brilliant. They're stable. They have something to lose. Something that makes them think twice before taking stupid risks." He'd swirled his drink, watching Marcus carefully. "I've seen too many young founders burn out, spiral, make catastrophic decisions because they have nothing anchoring them to reality. No offense, son, but you have the look of someone who lives inside their own head. That concerns me." The meeting had ended cordially, but Marcus knew a rejection when he heard one. Over the following weeks, other investors began asking similar questions. Casual inquiries about his personal life, concerned comments about work-life balance. One investor's wife had even suggested setting him up with her niece as if his romantic status was somehow relevant to his company's technology. But it was relevant. Marcus had done his research. Studies showed that married CEOs received more funding. They were perceived as more trustworthy, more stable, more mature. It was absurd. It was unfair. It was also reality. And Marcus Chen had built his entire life on playing reality's game better than anyone else. The solution had come to him at 3 in the morning, the way all his best ideas did. He'd been reviewing cap tables and investor profiles when he'd stumbled across an old Harvard Business Review article about the psychology of investor confidence. Buried in the data was a striking finding. CEOs in stable relationships received, on average, 37% higher valuations in early funding rounds. The article theorized it was about perceived risk management. If a founder could maintain a healthy relationship, investors reasoned, they could probably manage the chaos of scaling a startup. Marcus had closed his laptop and stared at the ceiling of his minimalist apartment. He didn't have time for a relationship. He barely had time to sleep. Vantage AI consumed every waking moment, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Romance, dating, partnership, all of it felt like a distraction from the only thing that mattered, building something that would outlast him. But what if he didn't need a real relationship? What if he just needed the appearance of one? The idea felt insane at first. Then it felt brilliant. Then it felt like the only logical solution. He'd spent the next week researching, discreetly asking questions, until he'd found what he was looking for: an agency. Not the kind advertised in neon lights or sketchy websites. This was high-end, professional, designed for executives who needed a companion for events but couldn't afford the complications of actual dating. They called it social partnering. Marcus called it perfect. The agency had sent him 3 profiles. He'd chosen her based purely on practicality. Elena, 28 years old, degree in international relations from Columbia, fluent in 4 languages. experience accompanying clients to everything from charity galas to business dinners. Her photograph showed a woman with sharp eyes and an enigmatic smile. She looked like she belonged in his world. That was all that mattered. Their first meeting had been at a neutral location, a quiet cafe in Midtown where the lighting was dim and the clientele minded their own business. Marcus had arrived with a folder containing a detailed brief: his background, his company, the story they would tell, the investors they would convince. He'd expected a simple transaction: sign the agreement, establish the terms, begin the performance. Elena had sat across from him, ordered a black coffee, and read through his entire proposal without saying a word. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend so investors will give you more money. I want to create a strategic advantage using social dynamics that already exist. You'll be compensated extremely well." How well? He'd named a figure that made her eyebrows rise slightly, the first crack in her composure. "And what exactly does this involve?" "Attending events, meeting investors, playing the role of my partner. You'll need to be knowledgeable enough about my work to discuss it casually, affectionate enough to be believable, professional enough to maintain boundaries." She'd studied him for a long moment. "Why not just find an actual girlfriend?" "Because I don't have time to fail at a real relationship. This is too important." Something had flickered in her eyes then. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. "You really think this will work?" "I think perception shapes reality more than people want to admit. And right now, I need to shape how investors perceive me." She'd signed the contract that afternoon. They'd shaken hands like business partners, which is exactly what they were. Marcus had felt satisfied, efficient, in control. He'd identified a problem and solved it. The fact that the solution involved a beautiful woman playing a role was irrelevant. This was strategy, not romance. Their first public appearance together had been at the Vantage AI annual investor mixer. Elena had arrived at his apartment an hour early, dressed in a midnight blue dress that probably cost more than the fee he was paying her. She'd reviewed note cards about his company, asked intelligent questions about his technology, and insisted they establish what she called organic touchpoints. "If we're going to sell this," she'd said, adjusting his tie with surprising familiarity, "we need to look like we actually know each other. Real couples have inside jokes, shared glances, small gestures that communicate entire conversations." Marcus had nodded, appreciating her professionalism. But when they'd walked into that event together, her hand warm in his, her laugh bright as she charmed a group of skeptical investors, something unexpected happened. People believed it. Not just believed it, they loved it. William Kingsley himself had pulled Marcus aside, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Now this is what I like to see, a man with his priorities straight." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus, but the results were undeniable. Over the next month, Elena accompanied him to dinners, conferences, a weekend retreat in Napa Valley, where investors discussed market trends over wine that tasted like liquid money. She never broke character. She asked thoughtful questions. She laughed at the right moments. She touched his arm in ways that suggested intimacy without crossing lines they'd never discussed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. It started with small things. The way she'd text him articles she thought he'd find interesting. How she'd memorized the names of everyone on his executive team. The night she'd stayed late helping him prepare for a crucial pitch, ordering takeout and reviewing slides until 3 a.m. Not because the contract required it, but because she seemed genuinely invested in his success. Marcus told himself it meant nothing. This was her job. She was good at it. That was why he'd hired her. But late at night, alone in his apartment, he'd find himself replaying conversations. The way her eyes lit up when she was excited about an idea. The sound of her voice when she wasn't performing for investors. The moment she'd looked at him during that pitch preparation and said, "You're going to change everything, Marcus. I really believe that." No one had ever said his name quite like that before. Now, standing in his office with rain streaking down the windows, Marcus stared at the contract in his hand. In 2 days, the Kingsley Group would make their final decision. Either they'd lead a Series C funding round that would value Vantage AI at over $1 billion, or they'd walk away, and other investors would follow like dominoes falling. Everything he'd built hung in the balance, and Elena, the woman he'd hired to play a role, had just sent him a message that made his blood run cold. "We need to talk tonight. It's about Kingsley. I found something you need to see." His phone buzzed again, another message. "Marcus, I think someone knows. Retry TM." The apartment felt different when she arrived. Marcus had been in this space 1,000 times, usually alone, usually working, the silence broken only by the hum of his computer and the distant sound of the city below. But tonight, with Elena standing in his living room, still wearing the cream blazer she'd worn to whatever meeting she'd come from, everything seemed sharper, more real. The carefully curated minimalism of his space, all clean lines and expensive emptiness, suddenly felt like what it was, a place where someone lived but didn't actually have a life. She didn't sit down. That was the first sign something was seriously wrong. Elena always sat, always made herself comfortable, always had this way of inhabiting a space like she belonged there. It was one of the things that made her so convincing at these events. She never looked nervous or out of place. But now she stood by the window, arms crossed, and Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. "What did you find?" he asked, keeping his voice level. In crisis, Marcus Chen became calmer. It was his superpower and his curse. Elena pulled out her phone, scrolled through something, then looked up at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Not the professional warmth she showed investors, not the easy humor she used when they were alone. This was something else, something that looked almost like fear. "I was at the Kingsley Group office this afternoon. Not with you, separately. William Kingsley's assistant, Margaret. She's friendly with the coordinator at the agency. They have coffee sometimes. Margaret mentioned me specifically, asked questions." Marcus felt his chest tighten. What kind of questions? The kind that suggests they're doing more than casual background research. She wanted to know how long we've been together, whether I attend all your events. She asked about my family, my background, whether I've met your parents. Elena's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "Marcus, they're not just impressed by you having a girlfriend. They're investigating whether that girlfriend is real." The room tilted slightly. Marcus moved to the couch, sat down, tried to think. This was a problem. This was a variable he hadn't accounted for. In all his careful planning, all his strategic thinking, he'd assumed the performance would be enough. He'd underestimated how thoroughly these people examined everything before they wrote 9-figure checks. Did she seem suspicious? She seemed thorough. There's a difference. Elena finally moved, pacing now, and Marcus recognized the gesture. It was what he did when he was working through a problem. The Kingsley Group doesn't just invest in companies, they invest in people, in stories. And they fact-check those stories like investigative journalists. If they dig deep enough, they'll find the agency, they'll find the contract, they'll find out this entire relationship is a performance. The word hung in the air between them. Performance. It was true, of course. That's exactly what this was. What it had always been. So why did hearing her say it out loud feel like a small betrayal? Marcus ran his hand through his hair, a rare visible sign of stress. "What do we do?" Elena stopped pacing, turned to face him. In the low light of the apartment, she looked different than she did at those polished events. More human, more vulnerable. "We have two options. We come clean to them, tell them the truth and hope they respect the honesty, or we go deeper, make this so real they can't find any cracks. How do we do that?" She walked over to where he sat, and for a moment, Marcus thought she was going to sit beside him. Instead, she knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with him. It was such an unexpected gesture that he almost forgot to breathe. "We stop treating this like a business arrangement," she said quietly. "We start treating it like what it needs to appear to be. A relationship. That means messy. That means history. That means creating a story detailed enough to withstand scrutiny. We have a story. We met at a tech conference. You work in consulting. We've been together for 8 months, she finished. I know the script, Marcus, but that's not enough anymore. Real couples have depth, they have moments, they have evidence scattered through their lives like breadcrumbs. She pulled out her phone again, showed him her Instagram. Look at this. My social media. It's professional, polished, completely generic. No photos of us together. No check-ins at places we've supposedly been. No tagged posts or comments that suggest I'm part of your life. If someone really looks, it doesn't hold up. Marcus hadn't thought about digital footprints. Another oversight. Another crack in the facade he'd built. So we need to create that history, he said slowly. Backdated posts, shared moments, evidence of a relationship that's been developing over time. More than that, Elena stood, moved to the window again. We need the story to be true in every way except the most important one. What do you mean? She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city glistening and reflective. I mean, we need to actually spend time together. Not for events, not for investors, just together. Enough that when someone asks you what my favorite book is, or what I'm afraid of, or what I do on Sunday mornings, you can answer without thinking. Because you know. Because you've seen it. The implications of what she was suggesting slowly settled over Marcus. This wasn't just about creating false evidence. This was about closing the distance between the performance and reality until there was no discernible difference. That's a significant time commitment, he said, falling back on the language of business because it was safer than acknowledging the other feelings creeping into his chest. Elena laughed, but it wasn't her usual laugh. This one had an edge. Everything with you is about time management, isn't it? Marcus, we're 2 days away from the biggest meeting of your life. If the Kingsley Group walks away because they think you've been lying to them, it's not just about the funding. Word spreads. Other investors will hear that you tried to manipulate them with a fake relationship. Your reputation, everything you've built, it all becomes suspect. She was right. Of course she was right. Marcus had built Vantage AI on trust, on the promise that his technology could see patterns others missed, could predict outcomes with unprecedented accuracy. If investors found out he'd manufactured something as fundamental as his personal life, why would they trust anything else he said? Okay, he said. Tell me what you need. What Elena needed, it turned out, was intimate. Not romantic exactly, but something that felt even more exposing. Over the next 48 hours, they essentially moved into each other's lives. She showed up at his apartment at 6 in the morning with coffee and bagels, and they had breakfast together while she asked him questions that had nothing to do with his company. What did he want to be when he was a child? Where did he grow up? What's the worst mistake he ever made? Questions that real partners would know the answers to. She took him to her apartment, a small but carefully decorated space in Brooklyn that was the complete opposite of his sterile penthouse. Books everywhere. Plants that actually seemed to be thriving. Photographs on the walls, not of magazine-quality moments, but of real life. Her sister's wedding. A trip to Greece. Her grandmother's hands kneading bread dough. This is who I am, she said, and there was something defiant in her voice. Not the woman who goes to your investor dinners. Not the professional companion. This. Marcus walked through her space slowly, taking it in. There was a Russian novel on her nightstand, pages marked with sticky notes covered in cramped handwriting. A yoga mat rolled up in the corner. A refrigerator covered in takeout menus and a single postcard from Prague. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that he knew almost nothing about the woman he'd been presenting as his partner for months. Tell me about your family, he said. She did. Her parents had immigrated from Russia when she was 7. Her father had been an engineer, her mother a music teacher. They'd wanted her to be a doctor or a lawyer, something stable and impressive. Instead, she'd studied international relations, worked for a nonprofit for 2 years, then taken this job with the agency because it paid better than anything else she was qualified for, and her student loans were crushing her. Do they know what you do? They think I'm an executive assistant for various clients, corporate events, business dinners, which isn't entirely untrue. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. They wouldn't understand this. My mother especially. She'd think I was, I don't know, selling something I shouldn't be selling. You're not, Marcus said, and he meant it. You're providing a service. There's nothing wrong with that, isn't there? Elena sat on her couch, tucked her legs under her. Sometimes I wonder, when I'm at these events pretending to be someone's girlfriend, someone's fiancée, someone's wife, I'm good at it, Marcus, really good. And that scares me sometimes, how easy it is to play a role, how natural it feels to be someone I'm not. Marcus sat across from her, and for the first time since they'd met, the silence between them wasn't comfortable. It was heavy with things neither of them was saying. For what it's worth, he said carefully, I don't think you're playing a role. Not entirely. The woman who shows up to those events, who's brilliant and charming and makes investors feel like they're part of something special, that's real. That's you. Is it? Or is it just another version of me that I've created because it's useful? The question hung there, unanswerable. Because Marcus understood exactly what she meant. He'd spent his entire adult life creating a version of himself that was useful. The confident CEO, the visionary founder, the man who always had a plan. Was any of that real? Or was he just performing too, so convincing that even he'd forgotten it was an act? They spent that night creating their digital history. Elena was meticulous about it, not just posting photos, but crafting a narrative that felt authentic. A picture of them at a coffee shop, supposedly from 6 months ago, with a caption about early morning strategy sessions becoming her favorite part of the day. A check-in at a bookstore with a comment about how Marcus always found the most obscure biographies. Small moments that, taken together, painted a picture of two people building something real. Marcus watched her work, impressed by her attention to detail. But more than that, he found himself wishing the moments she was fabricating had actually happened. That picture of them at the coffee shop, he wanted to remember taking it. That bookstore check-in, he wanted to recall the actual afternoon they'd spent there. When had the line blurred? When had he stopped thinking of this as a strategic arrangement and started wishing it was something else? It was 2 in the morning when Elena finally closed her laptop and rubbed her eyes. They were back at his apartment, surrounded by empty coffee cups and the detritus of manufactured memories. I think that's enough, she said. It looks real. If anyone goes digging, they'll find a consistent story. Elena, Marcus said, and his voice sounded different, uncertain. What happens after? After what? After the Kingsley meeting. After they make their decision. Whether they invest or walk away, what happens to us? She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the same question he'd been avoiding for weeks. The contract had an end date. 3 months, renewable if needed. They were past that now, operating on an unspoken agreement that they'd continue until the Kingsley deal was done. But after that, I don't know, she said quietly. What do you want to happen? It was the most honest question anyone had asked him in years. And Marcus, who always had an answer, who'd built an empire on decisive action and clear thinking, found he didn't know how to respond. Because what he wanted and what was practical weren't the same thing anymore. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure which one mattered more. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. A message from William Kingsley's office. The meeting had been moved up. Not in 2 days. Tomorrow, 11 a.m. And the message included one additional line that made Marcus's blood run cold. Mr. Kingsley requests that Elena join you for this meeting. He'd like to get to know the woman behind the man he's considering partnering with. Retry TM. The Kingsley Group headquarters occupied 3 floors of a building in Midtown that looked like it had been designed to intimidate. All glass and steel and soaring ceilings that made voices echo. Marcus had been here twice before, but never like this. Never with everything on the line. Never with Elena beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they stepped out of the elevator. A gesture so natural now that he almost forgot it hadn't always been real. She wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored perfectly with a silk blouse the color of champagne underneath. Professional but not corporate. Elegant but not trying too hard. She'd thought about this outfit the way a general thinks about battlefield strategy, and Marcus appreciated the care she'd taken. Every detail mattered now. Every gesture would be scrutinized. The receptionist smiled at them with the kind of warmth that felt calculated. "Mr. Kingsley is expecting you. Conference room 3, can I get either of you anything, coffee, water?" "We're fine, thank you," Elena said. And her voice had that quality it always had at these meetings. Warm, confident, utterly at ease. Marcus envied her that ability. He'd learned to fake confidence in boardrooms, but Elena seemed to genuinely possess it. They walked down a hallway lined with photographs of successful investments, tech companies that had started as nothing and become household names. Marcus recognized several founders he'd met at conferences, their faces frozen in moments of triumph. Would his photograph join them eventually? Or would this hallway be the last place his dream lived before it died? The conference room was smaller than he'd expected. Intimate. A oval table, 6 chairs, windows overlooking the city but somehow making it feel distant and irrelevant. William Kingsley stood at the far end, studying something on his tablet. He looked up when they entered and his smile was genuine. That was either a very good sign or a very bad one. "Marcus, Elena, please, sit." He gestured to chairs across from him. "I appreciate you both coming on such short notice. I know moving the meeting up probably disrupted your schedules." "Not at all," Marcus said, taking his seat. Elena sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "We're grateful for your time regardless of when it happens." Kingsley nodded, but his attention was on Elena. Not in a way that was inappropriate. More like he was studying a piece of art, trying to understand what made it valuable. "Elena, I've heard so much about you over these past months. It's interesting, isn't it? How we measure people by who stands beside them." Elena smiled. "I think it says something about what we value as a society. The partnerships we keep, the people we choose to build our lives around." "Exactly." Kingsley set down his tablet, leaned back in his chair. "I've been in this business for 30 years, invested in hundreds of companies, lost money on quite a few of them, made fortunes on others, and I've noticed something consistent. The founders who succeed long-term, the ones who don't just have a great exit but build something lasting, they have balance, they have perspective, they have someone who reminds them that there's a world outside their company." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was the narrative they'd built, the reason Elena existed in his life, at least as far as investors knew. But hearing Kingsley articulate it so precisely made the deception feel heavier somehow. "I won't pretend running Vantage doesn't consume most of my time," Marcus said carefully. "But Elena's been invaluable in helping me maintain perspective, in remembering why I'm building what I'm building." "Tell me about that," Kingsley said, and now his full attention shifted to Elena. "Why is he building it? From your perspective. Not the pitch, not the vision statement. What drives Marcus Chen at 3 a.m. when everyone else has gone home?" It was a trap, or maybe a test. Marcus held his breath because this wasn't something they'd rehearsed. They'd prepared for questions about Vantage, about the technology, about market positioning and competitive advantages. But this was personal. This required Elena to see inside him in ways that 3 months of performance couldn't have prepared her for. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she turned slightly in her chair, looked at Marcus, and something in her expression made his chest tighten. When she spoke, her voice was softer than her usual boardroom tone. "Marcus doesn't talk about this much, but his father ran a small electronics repair shop in San Francisco. Worked 14-hour days fixing other people's broken things, always one bad month away from losing everything." Marcus watched that growing up. Watched his father's hands shake when bills came in. Watched his mother take a second job just to keep them afloat. And he decided very young that he would never be vulnerable like that. That he would build something so secure, so valuable that uncertainty could never touch him. She paused, and Marcus realized with startling clarity that he'd told her that story. Not as part of their preparation, not as backstory for investors. Late one night, when they'd been working on pitch materials and he'd been exhausted enough to be honest, he'd mentioned his father. He'd mentioned the fear. And Elena had remembered. She'd filed it away, understood its importance, and now she was using it to paint a picture of him that was more true than anything in his carefully crafted biography. But somewhere along the way, Elena continued, I think the goal shifted. It stopped being about security and became about legacy, about building something that matters, that changes how people interact with information, with decision-making, with truth itself. His technology isn't just about profit. It's about creating a tool that makes the world more transparent, less vulnerable to the kind of uncertainty that destroyed people like his father. Kingsley nodded slowly, and Marcus couldn't tell if he was impressed or skeptical. That's a compelling narrative, very mission-driven, but it also sounds like the kind of thing a good partner would say to make their CEO boyfriend seem more three-dimensional. The words landed like a physical blow. Elena went very still beside him, and Marcus felt his carefully maintained composure start to crack. This was it, the moment they'd been dreading. Kingsley knew, or suspected, and he was giving them a chance to come clean before he made his final decision. But Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke, there was steel in her voice. Mr. Kingsley, with respect, I don't need to make Marcus seem three-dimensional. He is three-dimensional. The fact that you're struggling to reconcile the driven CEO with the person who actually has feelings and motivations beyond quarterly earnings says more about your assumptions than it does about him. The temperature in the room shifted. Kingsley's eyebrows rose, and Marcus felt simultaneously terrified and electrified. Elena had just pushed back against a billionaire investor who could make or break their future with a single phone call. It was either brilliant or catastrophic, and he wouldn't know which until Kingsley responded. Then Kingsley laughed. A real laugh, not the polite chuckle of business transactions. Fair point indeed. He looked at Marcus with new interest. She's got spine, this one. I like that. Too many people in this industry spend all their time telling me what they think I want to hear. He stood, walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. But here's what I'm struggling with, Marcus. And I'm going to be direct, because I think you both deserve that. Marcus braced himself. This was where Kingsley would reveal that he'd discovered the contract, the agency, the entire elaborate fiction they'd constructed. I ran a background check on Elena, Kingsley said, still facing the window. Standard procedure. Nothing invasive, just the basics. And I found something interesting. She works for an agency, companion services, high-end social partnering for executives who need someone presentable for events. The world tilted. Marcus felt Elena tense beside him, but before he could respond, before he could scramble for an explanation that might salvage this disaster, Kingsley turned around, and he was smiling. So I called the agency directly, spoke to the owner, asked about their services. And you know what I learned? That agency is incredibly selective. They don't just hire attractive people who can make small talk. They recruit individuals with advanced degrees, professional backgrounds, people who bring real value to conversations. Their model is actually quite brilliant. They're filling a gap in the market for executives who need intelligent companionship at professional events but don't have time for traditional dating. Marcus's mind raced, trying to understand where this was going. Elena's hand found his under the table, squeezed once. A warning, or comfort, or both. The owner told me something else interesting, Kingsley continued. She said their clients sometimes meet through the agency and end up in real relationships, that the professional arrangement becomes a foundation for something genuine. She was quite proud of that fact, actually. Said it happens more often than people expect. He moved back to the table, sat down, and his expression was unreadable. So here's my question, and I want you both to think carefully before answering. Did you meet through that agency? Is that how this started? The room was so quiet Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. He looked at Elena, saw his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. They were at a crossroads. They could lie, deny everything, hope Kingsley didn't have enough evidence to be certain, or they could tell a version of the truth and hope his response was what it seemed to be, understanding rather than judgment. Elena spoke first. Yes, that's how we met. Marcus needed someone to accompany him to events. I was looking for work that paid better than my non-profit job. It was a professional arrangement. Was, Kingsley repeated. Past tense. Past tense, Elena confirmed, and Marcus heard something in her voice he'd never heard before. Vulnerability. Because somewhere along the way it stopped being professional. It became something else. Something neither of us planned for or knew how to navigate. And that's terrifying, Mr. Kingsley, because I've spent my entire life planning things. Being strategic, making sure I never become vulnerable to chaos. And this, whatever this is now, it's chaos. Marcus stared at her. They hadn't discussed this response. This wasn't part of any strategy session or preparation. Elena was saying something true, something real, and he didn't know if it was brilliant improvisation or actual confession. Kingsley was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, and set it on the table facing them. It showed a photograph, old and slightly faded. A younger Kingsley standing beside a woman at what looked like a corporate event. She was beautiful, professional, clearly not belonging to his usual social circle. That's my wife, Catherine. 32 years ago, I hired her to be my assistant for a major deal. I needed someone who could keep me organized, make me look good in front of investors who thought I was too young and reckless to be trusted with their money. She was brilliant, capable, and had no interest in romance. She wanted a paycheck. I wanted competence. He smiled at the photograph. We got married 2 years later. My father thought I was insane, said I was confusing professional chemistry with personal compatibility. But he was wrong. Catherine understood me better than anyone precisely because she'd seen me at my worst under pressure, making impossible decisions. She'd watched me fail and succeed, and she chose to stay anyway. Not because she was paid to, but because she wanted to. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Kingsley wasn't condemning them, he was recognizing them. So when I found out about the agency, Kingsley continued, I wasn't scandalized, I was curious. Because I wanted to know if what I was seeing at those events was performance or reality. If Elena was just very good at her job, or if something real had developed despite the transactional origins. And what did you conclude? Marcus asked, his voice rough. I concluded that it doesn't matter how it started. What matters is where you are now. And from what I've observed, you two have something that most couples take years to build. Partnership, mutual respect, the ability to challenge each other without destroying each other. He leaned forward. That's what I invest in, Marcus. Not just technology, not just market opportunity. I invest in people who have the emotional intelligence to navigate success without self-destructing. And I believe you have that. Both of you. Both. Marcus should have felt relief. Triumph. This was the moment he'd been working toward for months. Kingsley was saying yes. The funding was happening. Everything he'd planned was coming together. But instead, he felt something closer to vertigo. Because Kingsley's assumption, his belief that what Marcus and Elena had was real, was based on observations of moments that had been choreographed, gestures that had been strategic, a relationship that existed primarily as performance, except somewhere in the past 48 hours, maybe the past few weeks, maybe from the very beginning, the performance had started to feel less like acting and more like prophecy. They'd been pretending to be in love so convincingly that the pretending had become indistinguishable from the real thing. Or had it? Mr. Kingsley, Marcus said slowly, I need to be clear about something. When Elena and I met, it was transactional. I hired her because I needed investors to perceive me as more stable, more trustworthy. And she agreed because she needed the money and was good at the work. Everything you've seen at events, every interaction, it started as strategy. I know, Kingsley said simply. But I don't know what it is now, Marcus continued. And he realized he wasn't just talking to Kingsley anymore. He was talking to Elena, to himself. I don't know where the strategy ends and the truth begins. And that should terrify me, because I've built my entire life on clarity and control. But instead it feels like the only honest thing I've done in years. Elena was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Kingsley stood, straightened his tie, and smiled. That's all I needed to hear. My team will send over the term sheet by end of day. Welcome to the Kingsley Group portfolio, Marcus. I think you're going to change the world." He left the room and suddenly Marcus and Elena were alone in this space that felt too small and too large at the same time. The city stretched out beyond the windows. Millions of people living their lives, making their choices, navigating the impossible space between what they planned and what actually happened. "Did you mean it?" Elena asked quietly. "What you just said?" Marcus turned to face her fully. Her eyes were bright, uncertain, more real than he'd ever seen them. "I don't know." "Did you? What you said about chaos, about this becoming something you didn't plan for?" "I don't know either." And somehow that answer felt more honest than any carefully prepared response could have been. They'd spent months creating a fiction so convincing that they'd convinced themselves. Or maybe they'd spent months discovering a truth they'd been too afraid to name. The line between those two possibilities had disappeared entirely, leaving them standing in territory neither had mapped. Marcus's phone buzzed. A message from his CFO. Congratulations were spreading through the company. News of the Kingsley investment was already leaking. Vantage AI's valuation had just crossed $1 billion. Everything Marcus had worked for, everything he'd sacrificed and strategized and fought for had finally materialized. But all he could think about was the woman sitting across from him, who'd agreed to play a role and somewhere along the way had stopped acting. Or maybe had never been acting at all. Maybe from the very first moment, in that quiet cafe in Midtown, they'd both been pretending to pretend, using strategy as permission to want something they'd been too afraid to reach for directly. "What do we do now?" Elena asked, and the question contained multitudes. What do we do about the contract that officially ended today? What do we do about the feelings neither of them could name? What do we do about the fact that everyone believes they're in love, and neither of them knows if that belief is accurate or aspirational? Before Marcus could answer, Elena's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and something in her expression changed. Went carefully blank in a way that made Marcus's instincts flare. "I need to take this," she said, standing, moving toward the window. "It's important." She answered in Russian, her voice low, and Marcus watched her body language shift. Tension in her shoulders, her free hand forming a fist. Whatever the conversation was about, it wasn't good news. When she finally hung up, she stood very still for a moment, staring out at the city. "Elena." Marcus stood, moved closer. "What's wrong?" She turned to face him, and her eyes held something he'd never seen there before. Not fear exactly. Something sharper, more complicated. "That was my sister," she said quietly. "She saw the news about your funding round, saw the articles mentioning me as your partner, and she's confused because 2 months ago when she was visiting New York, I told her I was single, working too much to date. So she's asking questions I don't know how to answer." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make me realize how many lies I've told. Not just to investors, to my family, to myself." Elena's voice was steady, but her hands weren't. "My parents are flying in next week, for my birthday. They want to meet you. The man who's apparently been the most important person in my life for months. And I don't know how to tell them that the most important person in my life is someone I'm not sure I actually know outside of corporate events and carefully staged moments." The implications crashed over Marcus like a wave. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about families, about futures, about the expanding circle of deception that came with every choice they'd made. "We'll figure it out," he said. But even he could hear how inadequate that sounded. "Will we?" Elena looked at him and her gaze was almost pleading. "Marcus, we just lied to a billionaire investor. Well, not lied exactly, but we let him believe a version of events that's only partially true. And he bought it. Completely. Because we've gotten so good at this performance that even we can't tell what's real anymore." She was right. They'd crossed some invisible line, moved from conscious deception into territory where the deception had taken on a life of its own. And now, they were trapped in a story they'd written, unable to step outside it without destroying everything they'd built. "So what do you want to do?" Marcus asked. "Do you want to end this? Tell everyone the truth? Walk away?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility and loss. Elena opened her mouth to answer, and in that moment, Marcus realized with terrifying clarity that whatever she said next would determine not just the fate of their arrangement, but the shape of his entire future. Retry TM. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. Not resolve exactly. Something more complicated. The kind of decision that doesn't feel like clarity but like acceptance of complexity. "I don't want to walk away," she said finally, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to stay either. Not like this. Not when I can't tell the difference between what's strategic and what's real." Marcus felt something twist in his chest. He'd spent his entire adult life making decisions based on logic, on data, on calculated risk assessment. But standing here in this conference room that smelled faintly of leather and expensive coffee, looking at a woman who'd agreed to play a role and somehow become essential to his existence, he had no framework for what to do next. "Then we figure it out," he said. "Together. Not as part of a contract. Not as a performance for investors. Just as two people trying to understand what this actually is. And what if there's nothing to understand?" Elena's question was sharp, almost defensive. What if we've just convinced ourselves there's something real here because the alternative is too uncomfortable? That we've spent months lying to everyone, including ourselves? Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. Not a text. An actual call, which almost never happened unless something was urgent. He glanced at the screen. His COO, Jennifer. He considered ignoring it, but Jennifer only called when fires needed immediate attention. "I need to take this," he said apologetically. Elena nodded, turned back to the window, and Marcus stepped into the hallway. "Jen, what's happening? Where are you right now?" Jennifer's voice had that tightly controlled quality that meant she was managing a crisis. "Just finished the Kingsley meeting. It went well, better than well. They're sending the term sheet today." "That's great. That's amazing. But we have a problem. A big one." He heard her take a breath. "Someone leaked internal communications to TechCrunch, messages between you and the agency. The one you used to hire, Elena." The hallway tilted. Marcus put his hand against the wall to steady himself. "What?" "They're planning to run a story tomorrow. Billion-dollar startup CEO hired fake girlfriend to impress investors. They've got screenshots, Marcus. Contracts. Payment records. Everything." His mind raced, trying to understand how this was possible. The agency was discreet. That was their entire value proposition. They didn't leak client information. It would destroy their business model. How did they get it? "We don't know yet. But Marcus, this is going to be bad. Really bad. The story isn't just about you hiring someone for events. They're framing it as fraud, as manipulating investors by presenting false information about your personal life. The SEC could get involved. The Kingsley Group might pull out. Other investors might sue." Marcus felt like he was falling through space. Everything he'd built, everything he'd sacrificed for, crumbling because of a decision that had seemed so logical 3 months ago. Hire someone to play a role, create a strategic advantage. It had been brilliant until it wasn't. "Give me an hour," he said. "I need to think." "Marcus, we need a response plan. Legal needs to get involved. PR needs to craft a statement. We can't just wait and hope this goes away." "I know. 1 hour. I'll call you back." He hung up before she could argue, stood in the hallway trying to breathe. Through the glass wall of the conference room, he could see Elena still standing by the window, and he realized with crushing certainty that she didn't know yet. That in the next few minutes he was going to have to tell her that their carefully constructed fiction was about to be exposed to the world in the worst possible way. When he walked back in, she turned immediately. Whatever she saw in his face made her own expression tighten with concern. "What happened?" he told her. "Everything. The leak. The story. The potential consequences that spiraled out in every direction like cracks in glass." She listened without interrupting, and he watched the information settle over her like ash. "When does it publish?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. Maybe tonight if they decide not to wait. Elena sank into one of the conference room chairs, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked small, vulnerable in a way that made him want to fix this so badly it physically hurt. "My parents," she said quietly. "They'll see it. Everyone I know will see it. I'll be the woman who pretended to be someone's girlfriend for money. That's how the story will be told. Not that I provided a professional service, that I was paid to deceive people. Elena, and they won't be wrong, will they? That's exactly what I did. What we did. We deceived everyone. Investors, your employees, our families. We created an elaborate lie, and now we're surprised that lies have consequences." Marcus pulled out a chair, sat across from her. The city stretched beyond the windows, indifferent to their crisis. Millions of people going about their lives while his imploded. "We have options," he said, falling back on problem solving because it was the only thing he knew how to do. "We can get ahead of the story, issue a statement before they publish, control the narrative." "What narrative? What could we possibly say that makes this okay?" "The truth. That we met through an agency, yes, but that what developed was real. That the relationship started as an arrangement but became something genuine. People understand that. It's not unprecedented." Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Marcus, we can't even agree between ourselves whether what we have is real. How are we supposed to convince the world? And more importantly, why would they believe us? We've already lied to them. Why would this statement be any different?" She was right. Of course she was right. Any statement they made now would be analyzed through the lens of their deception. Every word scrutinized, every gesture questioned. They'd lost credibility before the story even broke. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked, and he hated how helpless he sounded. He'd built $1 billion company by always having a plan, always being 3 steps ahead. But this was beyond strategy. This was human chaos, the kind no algorithm could predict or navigate. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood, smoothed her suit jacket with hands that were almost steady, and looked at him with an expression that broke something inside him. "I think I need to go home, process this, figure out what I'm going to tell my family before they read it in some tech blog." She paused at the door. "Marcus, I'm sorry. For all of it. For not being more careful. For letting this become complicated when it should have stayed simple." "It was never going to stay simple," he said. "Not from the moment you walked into that cafe and looked at me like you could see exactly who I was pretending to be." Something flickered in her eyes. Pain, or recognition, or both. Maybe that was the problem. We saw through each other's performances but never stopped performing. Then she was gone, and Marcus was alone in a conference room that suddenly felt like a cage. His phone buzzed continuously. Messages from Jennifer, from his legal team, from board members who'd somehow already heard rumors. The machine he'd built was demanding his attention, needing him to lead, to make decisions, to fix this crisis. But all he could think about was Elena walking away, and whether she was walking away from the situation or from him, and whether there was even a difference anymore. He spent the next 3 hours in emergency meetings. His legal team argued for aggressive action, threatening TechCrunch with lawsuits if they published. His PR team wanted a carefully crafted statement that acknowledged mistakes, while emphasizing the genuine nature of his relationship with Elena. His board wanted him to step down temporarily, while the situation resolved itself, to protect the company's reputation. Everyone had opinions, everyone had strategies, and none of them understood that the real problem wasn't the public relations disaster or the potential legal consequences. The real problem was that Marcus had spent 3 months creating a fiction so elaborate that he'd forgotten how to recognize truth. And now that fiction was collapsing, he didn't know what would be left when the dust settled. It was nearly 8 in the evening when he finally made it back to his apartment. The space felt different now, contaminated by the weight of everything that had happened. He poured himself a drink he didn't want, stood by the window looking at the city lights, and tried to think. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Chen? A woman's voice, professional, cautious. My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm the founder of the agency that connected you with Elena. Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. Did you leak the information? No, absolutely not. That's why I'm calling. Someone hacked our systems, stole client data, contracts, communications. We've reported it to the FBI, but I wanted you to know that this breach violated everything we stand for. Our business is built on discretion, and this... Her voice wavered. This destroys us. But more than that, it destroys the lives of people who trusted us. Do you know who did it? Not yet. But Mr. Chen, I need you to understand something. The person who leaked this information, they didn't just expose you. They exposed 23 other clients, executives, politicians, people whose careers will be ruined when this comes out. This isn't about you specifically. Someone wanted to damage the entire concept of what we do. Marcus processed this information slowly. It changed the calculus. This wasn't a targeted attack on him. He was collateral damage in someone's crusade against the agency. That should have felt better somehow. It didn't. What happens now? He asked. Now we all face the consequences. The story will run. Your relationship with Elena will be dissected publicly. And I'm sorry, Mr. Chen. I'm so deeply sorry that trying to solve a problem created so many more. She hung up, and Marcus stood in the growing darkness of his apartment, thinking about consequences and complexity and the distance between intentions and outcomes. He'd hired Elena to solve a problem, create stability, impress investors. It had been logical, strategic, smart, until it had become something else. Something he still couldn't name but could feel in his chest every time she smiled at him, like she was seeing past all his carefully constructed defenses. Something that made board meetings feel less important than the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. Something that had transformed from transaction to truth, so gradually he couldn't pinpoint the moment of change. His phone buzzed, a text from Elena, just 3 words. Are you okay? He stared at those words for a long time. Such a simple question, the kind of thing people asked casually without expecting honest answers. But Elena wasn't asking casually. She was asking because despite everything, despite the chaos and the lies and the impending disaster, she actually cared whether he was okay. He started typing a response 3 times, deleted it 3 times, finally settled on the truth. No, but I don't know if I was okay before any of this either. The response came quickly. Can I come over? You don't have to. This is going to get worse before it gets better. If you distance yourself now, you might avoid some of the fallout. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then her reply. I'm not running from this. I'm not running from you. Give me 20 minutes. Marcus set down his phone, and for the first time since Jennifer's call, he felt something other than dread. Not hope, exactly, but something like it. The recognition that whatever was about to happen, whatever consequences they would face, he wouldn't face them alone. 23 minutes later, Elena arrived. She'd changed from the suit into jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, no makeup. She looked younger like this, more real. She carried a bag that clinked with glass bottles. I brought wine, she said, and Thai food, because if we're going to have a crisis, we might as well not be hungry. They sat on his couch, food spread between them, and for a while they didn't talk about the article or the consequences or any of it. They just ate, and it felt absurdly normal, like they were actually a couple having dinner, like this was routine rather than the eye of a hurricane. I called my parents, Elena said finally, told them everything before they could read it online. My mother cried, not because I'd done something wrong, but because I hadn't told her. Because I'd kept this entire part of my life hidden. What did you say? The truth. That I took a job with an agency. That I met you. That what started as professional became personal. That I didn't know how to explain it because I didn't fully understand it myself. She set down her wine glass. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if you were a good man, if you treated me well. What did you tell him? Elena looked at him and her eyes held something that made it hard to breathe. I told him you were complicated, brilliant, driven, sometimes frustrating. But yes, you treated me well. Better than well. You saw me. Not just the performance, the actual person underneath. Marcus felt something crack open inside him. Some wall he'd built so carefully it had become invisible until this moment when it started to crumble. Elena, I don't know how to fix this, any of it. The article is going to run, people are going to judge us, the company might suffer, your reputation will take a hit. And I can't make any promises about what happens after because I don't know. I don't have a strategy or a plan or any of the things I usually have. Good, she said quietly. Good? Marcus, we've spent 3 months being strategic, planning every gesture, calculating every word, and look where it got us. Maybe what we need now isn't another plan, maybe we just need to stop performing and see what's left when we do. She moved closer on the couch, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle that he'd learned to associate with her presence. Her hand found his, and the touch was electric in its simplicity. Tomorrow that article publishes, she said. Tomorrow everyone sees the contract and the payments and the arrangement. Tomorrow we face whatever consequences come from our choices. But tonight, right now, can we just be honest? No strategy, no performance. Just you and me figuring out what this actually is? Marcus looked at her, at this woman who'd agreed to play a role and somehow become the most real thing in his meticulously constructed life. And he realized that he'd been asking the wrong question all along. It didn't matter how they'd started. It didn't matter whether their first meetings had been transactional. What mattered was what they'd built since then. The moments that felt genuine even when everything else was performance. The way she made him laugh during stressful meetings. How she challenged him when he was being too rigid. The fact that when everything was falling apart, she was the person he wanted beside him. I think I'm in love with you, he said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff. And I don't know when it happened or if it's real or if I'm just confusing gratitude with affection. But when you're not around, I miss you. And when you are around, I feel like I can breathe properly. And that terrifies me because I've never let myself need anyone. Elena's eyes glistened, and he couldn't tell if she was going to kiss him, or leave, or laugh at the absurdity of his timing. Confessing feelings hours before their relationship was about to be exposed and dissected by the entire tech world. But before she could respond, his phone lit up with an alert. Not a call, a notification. The TechCrunch article. They'd published early. The headline glared from his screen in stark black letters, and beneath it, his photo next to Elena's, and the word that would define them for the foreseeable future. Fraud. Retry TM. The article loaded slowly, each paragraph appearing like evidence in a courtroom. Marcus read it with the detached precision of someone watching their own execution. They'd done their homework. Every detail was accurate. The initial contact with the agency, the contract terms, the payment schedule. Screenshots of emails where he'd outlined exactly what he needed. Someone intelligent, professional, convincing enough to make investors believe he had his life together. Elena read over his shoulder, her breath shallow. The article painted them both as calculating. Him as a manipulator willing to deceive investors for financial gain. Her as someone who sold authenticity for profit. The writer had even included quotes from anonymous sources. Other founders speculating about whether Marcus's entire public persona was manufactured. If he'd fake a relationship, what else might he fake? Revenue numbers? User metrics? The integrity of his technology itself? This is worse than I thought, Elena whispered. Marcus's phone began to ring, then buzz, then explode with notifications. Investors, board members, journalists requesting comment. His mother, who rarely called, leaving a voicemail he couldn't bring himself to listen to. The world was reacting in real time, and he could feel his reputation disintegrating with each passing second. Then Elena's phone started. Her sister, her parents again. Friends who'd seen the article, some supportive, others clearly shocked. The noise of it all became overwhelming, a cacophony of judgment and curiosity and schadenfreude. "Turn it off," Marcus said suddenly. "All of it. Just turn it off." They powered down their phones, and the silence that followed felt like stepping into a soundproof room. For a moment, they just sat there, two people at the center of a storm that was raging outside their ability to see or hear it. "What did you say?" Elena asked finally. "Before. What you were saying before the article posted." Marcus turned to face her fully. His entire world was collapsing. Everything he'd built threatened by a decision that had seemed so reasonable 3 months ago. But looking at her now, seeing the way she was looking back at him, he realized something fundamental. The article didn't change what he'd felt 10 minutes ago. The exposure didn't make his confession less true. "I said I think I'm in love with you. And I meant it. Even knowing everything that's happening. Maybe especially because of it." Elena's hand came up to her mouth. A breath. Then another. "Marcus, you can't just say that now. Not when everything is falling apart. Not when we're both emotional and scared and... When else am I supposed to say it? When we're performing for investors? When everything is carefully scripted?" "Elena, the whole problem has been that we've spent months saying what we thought we should say instead of what we actually felt. So I'm done with that. I love you. Or I'm falling in love with you. Or whatever the beginning of that feels like. And yes, it's terrible timing. And yes, the entire world is about to judge us for how we met. But none of that changes what's true." Tears spilled down her cheeks and she didn't wipe them away. "You're not supposed to be like this. You're supposed to be the logical one, the strategist. You're not supposed to confess love in the middle of a crisis. Maybe that's the only time confessions actually mean anything." She kissed him then. Not gently, not carefully. It was desperate and real and tasted like wine and tears and 3 months of restraint finally breaking. Marcus pulled her closer and for a moment, nothing else existed. Not the article, not the consequences. Just this. Just her. Just the feeling of finally letting himself want something without calculating whether it was strategically sound. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Elena rested her forehead against his. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've loved you for weeks, and I kept telling myself it wasn't real. That I was just playing a role so well I'd convinced myself. But that's not true. I fell in love with you in spite of the contract, not because of it. I fell in love with the version of you that exists at 3 a.m. when you're too tired to pretend. The one who actually cares about changing the world, not just building an empire." Marcus closed his eyes, let himself feel it. The relief, the terror, the absolute certainty that whatever happened next, this moment was worth everything that had led to it. A pounding on the door shattered the peace, urgent, insistent. Marcus tensed, but Elena squeezed his hand. "We face it," she said simply. "Whatever it is, we face it together." He opened the door to find Jennifer standing there, laptop in hand, looking like she'd run the entire way. "You turned off your phones. I've been trying to reach you for 30 minutes. Marcus, you need to see this." She pushed past them, set the laptop on his coffee table, pulled up Twitter. The TechCrunch article was trending, but that wasn't what she was showing them. She scrolled to a thread, started reading aloud. "This is from Sarah Chen. Your sister, Marcus. She posted 20 minutes ago." Marcus felt his stomach drop. His sister. He hadn't told her anything about Elena, about the arrangement, about any of it. She was going to be blindsided. But Jennifer was already reading, and the words weren't what he expected. "My brother called me 6 weeks ago at 2 a.m. He does that sometimes when he can't sleep, when the pressure gets too heavy. Usually he wants to talk about the company, about investor expectations, about whether he's making the right strategic choices. But that night was different. He told me about Elena, and for the first time in years, he didn't sound like a CEO. He sounded like my brother. The one who used to believe in impossible things before he learned to be practical. He told me he'd met someone who made him want to be less careful, who challenged him, who made him laugh during board meetings when he was supposed to be serious. And I remember thinking, finally, He's letting himself be human again. Jennifer scrolled down. The thread continued. So when I read this article tonight about contracts and deception, I want to say something. Yes, my brother made an unconventional choice. Yes, he approached a relationship with the same strategic thinking he applies to business. That's who he is. But reducing what he and Elena have to a transaction is like saying arranged marriages can't become real love. Like saying any relationship that starts from practical foundations is automatically fake. Life is messy. Love is messy. And sometimes the people we plan to keep at arm's length become the ones we can't imagine living without. Marcus stared at the screen. His sister, who he'd barely spoken to about his personal life, defending him publicly, making the argument he hadn't known how to make himself. It's spreading, Jennifer said, pulling up more screens. Other people are sharing similar stories. CEOs talking about the pressure to present a perfect image. Women discussing the unfair scrutiny of female companions at business events. There's a whole counter-narrative forming. You're not the villain in everyone's story, Marcus. For a lot of people, you're just human. Elena had moved to read over his shoulder, and Marcus felt her hand tighten on his arm. The narrative was shifting. Not completely. There were still plenty of people condemning them, calling for investigations, demanding accountability. But there were also people defending them, recognizing the complexity, acknowledging that relationships didn't always follow traditional paths. What does this mean? Marcus asked. Jennifer closed the laptop. It means you have a choice. You can hide from this. Let the narrative be controlled by others. Or you can tell your story. The real one. Not the strategic version. The messy, complicated, human truth. How? There's a reporter from the New York Times, Claire Morrison. She reached out an hour ago. Said she wants to do a deeper piece. Not just about the contract, but about the industry pressure that creates situations like yours. About the assumptions we make regarding successful people and their personal lives. She wants to interview both of you. On the record. No pre-approval of questions. Marcus looked at Elena. She met his eyes and he saw his own uncertainty reflected there. This would mean exposing everything. No more control. No more careful messaging. Just two people being honest about how they'd ended up here. It's a risk, Elena said quietly. We could make things worse. Or we could finally tell the truth, Marcus replied. Completely. Without strategy. They agreed to the interview. Claire Morrison arrived the next morning, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a recorder she placed between them on the coffee table with ceremony. She didn't start with softballs. Let's address it directly, she said. Marcus, you hired Elena through an agency to present a false image to investors. That's deception. How do you justify that? Marcus took a breath. No more corporate speak, no more polished responses. I don't justify it. It was deception. I looked at a problem, investor bias against unmarried founders, and I solved it the way I solve every problem. Strategically, efficiently, without considering the ethical implications or the emotional consequences. I treated human connection like a business transaction, and that was wrong. But you don't regret it. I regret how it started. I don't regret where it led me. Those are two different things. Claire turned to Elena. And you? You agreed to this arrangement. You took payment to pretend to be someone's girlfriend. Some people are calling you opportunistic, manipulative. Elena didn't flinch. Some people are right. I made a choice based on practical needs. I had student loans, limited job options in my field. An agency offered good money for work that played to my strengths, being professional, personable, presentable. I told myself it was harmless, that I was providing a service like an actor playing a role. But the thing about roles is they can become real if you're not careful. And I wasn't careful. When did it become real? Elena looked at Marcus and something passed between them. A shared memory. There was a night, probably 6 weeks in. We were at his office late, preparing for a pitch. I made a joke about one of the slides being too technical and he laughed. A real laugh, not the polite one he uses at events, and then he looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time and he said, "You make this bearable." Not the work, not the pressure. This. Life. And I realized I'd stopped thinking about the contract. I'd started thinking about him, about us, about whether this thing we were pretending to have could somehow become real. And did it become real? Marcus answered. Yes, but not in a way that erases how it started. We can't claim this is a traditional love story. It's not. It's messy and complicated and built on a foundation that most people would find questionable. But it's also the most honest relationship I've ever had, because Elena sees through all my strategies. She calls me on my attempts to control everything. She makes me human in a life that often feels like one long performance. Claire leaned forward. The criticism isn't just about deception. It's about what it says regarding the tech industry. That success requires manufacturing an image. That investors value perception over reality. Do you think that's true? Yes, Marcus said without hesitation. The data supports it. Married CEOs receive more funding. Founders who present stable personal lives are perceived as lower risk. It's not fair. It's not rational. But it's real. And I made a choice to play that game instead of challenging it. That's on me. So what changes? If you could go back knowing everything you know now, what would you do differently? Marcus looked at Elena. She nodded, giving permission for honesty. I wouldn't use an agency, but I also wouldn't have met Elena without it. So I don't know. I think maybe the question isn't what I'd do differently, but what we all need to do differently. Stop pretending that personal lives and professional success aren't connected. Stop judging founders for being human. Stop creating a culture where someone like me feels like they need to manufacture stability because authenticity isn't valued. The interview lasted 2 hours. Claire asked about the Kingsley investment, about Elena's family, about what they plan to do now. They answered everything, honestly, sometimes painfully. When she finally turned off her recorder, she sat back and studied them both. This will publish next week, she said. It won't make everyone forgive you, but it might help people understand you. Sometimes that's enough. After she left, Marcus and Elena sat in the silence of his apartment. The eye of the storm had passed. The fallout would continue for days, weeks, maybe longer. But something had shifted. They'd stopped hiding, stopped strategizing. They'd simply told the truth, and whether that truth was enough remained to be seen. What happens to Vantage? Elena asked. I don't know. The board is meeting tomorrow. They might ask me to step down. Kingsley might pull his investment. Or maybe they'll surprise me. I've learned that people are more unpredictable than algorithms. And us? What happens to us? Marcus pulled her close, felt her settle against him in a way that felt natural now. Earned. We figure it out. Day by day. Without a contract. Without a performance. Just two people who met unconventionally and fell in love despite their better judgment. Elena laughed softly. That's not much of a plan. No, Marcus agreed. It's not, but maybe that's the point. His phone, powered back on, buzzed with a message. William Kingsley. Marcus almost didn't open it, afraid of what it might say. But Elena squeezed his hand and he read it. I've been in business 50 years. Seen every kind of deal, every kind of person. What I value most isn't perfection. It's authenticity under pressure. You showed me that yesterday. Your investment stands. But Marcus, take some advice from someone who's been where you are. The empire you're building won't mean anything if you destroy yourself building it. Take care of what matters. Everything else is just numbers. Marcus showed Elena the message. She read it twice, then kissed his temple. He's right, you know. About what matters. I know. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm. People working, living, loving, making mistakes, finding redemption. Marcus thought about his father's repair shop, about watching uncertainty slowly destroy a good man. He'd built Vantage to escape that vulnerability, to create something so solid that chaos couldn't touch it. But maybe that had been the wrong goal all along. Maybe the point wasn't to eliminate vulnerability, but to find someone worth being vulnerable with. Someone who saw your strategies and loved you anyway. Someone who'd walk into the fire beside you because being alone was worse than burning together. Retry TM. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same conference room where everything had changed. The windows still overlooked the city. The table was still polished to a mirror shine. But nothing felt the same. William Kingsley sat across from him, older somehow, though perhaps it was just the afternoon light catching silver in his hair. Between them, documents that represented the official closing of the Series C funding round. Vantage AI was now valued at $1.2 billion. Marcus Chen was, on paper, a success story for the ages. But that wasn't why Kingsley had asked for this meeting. "I wanted to tell you something," Kingsley said, pushing the signed documents aside like they were less important than the conversation. "When Catherine died last year, I almost pulled out of active investing. Couldn't see the point anymore. She was the one who believed in these big swings, in backing people who were trying to change things. Without her, it all felt like just moving money around." Marcus listened, understanding that this was about more than business advice. "But watching you these past months, watching how you handled the crisis, the article, the scrutiny, you reminded me why we do this. Not to make rich people richer. To find people who are willing to be honest about their flaws while still reaching for something extraordinary. That's rare, Marcus, don't lose sight of it." They shook hands, and Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settle differently than it had before. Not as burden, as purpose. He found Elena in the building's lobby, sitting on one of those uncomfortable modern benches that looked better than they felt. She'd been meeting with a publisher about a book she was writing, not a memoir exactly. More of an examination of authenticity in professional spaces, how we perform versions of ourselves and what gets lost in translation. The advance was modest but meaningful. Her first project that was entirely hers. "How did it go?" she asked as he sat beside her. "It's done. The money's transferred. Vantage is officially a unicorn." He said it without fanfare. The achievement felt both monumental and oddly hollow. He'd spent years chasing this milestone, and now that he'd reached it, all he could think about was what came next. "Congratulations," Elena said, and she meant it. She'd learned to navigate his complicated relationship with success, how he could be proud and dissatisfied simultaneously. They walked out into the late afternoon together, no destination in mind. The city moved around them with its characteristic indifference. Delivery trucks blocking intersections, tourists taking photos, a violinist playing Vivaldi outside a subway entrance, the case at his feet scattered with dollar bills and coins. "My mother called this morning," Elena said. "She saw the Times article, the follow-up piece about how we're doing now. She said she's proud of me." "That's good, right?" "I think so. It's hard to tell with her. But she said something interesting. She said that in Russia they have this concept, pokazuha. It means a false front, something done for show. She said she spent so much of her life after immigrating trying to perform American success for her parents back home, that she forgot what genuine happiness looked like. And now she sees me, trying to figure out the same thing. The difference between looking successful and actually being content." Marcus thought about this as they walked. The gap between appearance and reality, the effort required to bridge it. "Do you think we're content?" "I think we're trying to be, which might be the most honest we can manage." They'd fallen into a routine over the past months, not the carefully orchestrated public appearances of before, but actual domesticity. Elena kept a toothbrush at his apartment. He'd started spending weekends at her place in Brooklyn, where the streets felt more like neighborhoods than transit corridors. They cooked together badly but enthusiastically. They argued about small things, how to load a dishwasher, whether to watch documentaries or comedies, who got control of the thermostat. Normal couple conflicts that felt revolutionary in their ordinariness. The media attention had faded but not disappeared. There were still think pieces about them occasionally. Debates on business ethics podcasts. But the initial frenzy had moved on to newer scandals, fresher controversies. They'd become a footnote in the tech world's ongoing conversation about authenticity and performance. Marcus had testified before the SEC. The investigation concluded that while his approach had been ethically questionable, no laws had been broken. Investors had been aware of his company's metrics. The personal relationship, however it began, hadn't materially affected his disclosures. It was a legal victory that felt Pyrrhic. The law said he'd done nothing wrong, but he knew better. Some investors had pulled out. Smaller funds, mostly, who couldn't stomach the association. Others had doubled down, seeing the crisis and recovery as evidence of resilience. The portfolio had rebalanced itself around people who valued complicated humanity over polished performance. They ended up at a small park overlooking the East River. The sun was setting, painting the water orange and gold. Elena sat on a bench, and Marcus joined her, their shoulders touching in that unconscious way longtime partners occupy space together. "Do you think about what your life would look like if you'd never made that call?" Elena asked. "To the agency, if you just dealt with the investor pressure some other way." Marcus considered this. It was a question he'd asked himself countless times, especially during the worst of the fallout. "I think about it, but I don't know that I'd be happier. Maybe more ethical. Definitely simpler. But Vantage would probably be in a different place, and I wouldn't have you. So the calculus gets complicated." "That's not really an answer." "No, it's not. Because I'm not sure there is an answer. We make choices based on who we are in that moment, with the information and emotional capacity we have available. Looking back and judging those choices with everything we know now, that's easy. But it's also unfair to the person we were." Elena leaned her head on his shoulder. Very philosophical for a tech CEO. "I've had time to think. Crisis has that effect. A jogger passed them, then a couple walking a dog, then 3 teenagers sharing earbuds and laughing at something on a phone. Life continuing in its messy, unplanned way." Marcus thought about his father, about the repair shop that had closed when he was in college. His father had died 2 years later, heart attack, stress probably a contributing factor. Marcus had built Vantage partially in response to that loss, determined to create something that couldn't be taken away by bad luck or market forces, but he'd learned something these past months. Nothing was permanent. Not companies, not reputations, not even love, though that was the thing you fought hardest to protect. Security was an illusion, a story we told ourselves to make existence feel less terrifying. What mattered was how you responded when that illusion shattered, whether you had people beside you when it did. "I saw Sarah yesterday," Marcus said. His sister had become unexpectedly important in his life again, their relationship rekindled by crisis. "She said something that stuck with me. She said the version of me before this, the one who had everything planned and controlled, he was successful but not very interesting. And she likes this version better. The one who makes mistakes and admits to them." "Do you like this version better?" "I think so. He's more exhausting, more uncertain, but he feels more real." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade from the sky. In a few hours, Marcus would be back at his apartment reviewing code, planning the next product launch, thinking about scaling challenges and market positioning. The work never stopped. But now there were also evenings like this, moments where the empire he was building felt less important than the life he was living. His phone buzzed. A message from Jennifer. The board had approved his proposal for a new initiative, investing company resources into programs that supported first-generation entrepreneurs. People who didn't have the networks or polish or perfect personal narratives. It was a small thing maybe, but it felt like penance and progress simultaneously. "They approved it," he told Elena. She smiled. "Good. You should use what you learned. Make it mean something beyond just our story." That was the hope. That their mistakes and revelations could create space for other people to be honest about their struggles. That the tech industry might slowly, incrementally, become slightly less obsessed with performance and slightly more accepting of complexity. Marcus didn't know if that would actually happen. Change was slow, culture was stubborn, but he'd learned that hoping for better while accepting reality was a skill worth cultivating. "Elena," he said, and she turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day. "What do you think we're doing?" Long term, I mean. Are we building towards something specific, or are we just figuring it out as we go? She was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I think we're learning to be uncomfortable together. That's not romantic, but it might be more important than romance. You're learning that not everything can be optimized. I'm learning that strategic thinking isn't inherently evil, just incomplete. And together we're learning that the space between planning and chaos, that's where actual life happens. It was the most honest answer anyone had ever given him. No promises of forever. No pretense that love conquered all. Just an acknowledgement that they were both works in progress, and they'd chosen to be works in progress together. As darkness fell properly, they stood to leave. Elena's hand found his, and they walked back through the city toward wherever they'd end up. His apartment or hers. A restaurant they'd been meaning to try. It didn't really matter. The destination was less important than the journey, which was the kind of cliché that Marcus would have dismissed before, but now understood contained a truth too essential to ignore. The woman he'd needed as a pretend girlfriend had become the real queen of his empire, but not in the way he'd imagined. She didn't rule beside him in boardrooms or investor meetings. She reigned over the parts of his life he'd neglected while building his company. His humanity. His capacity for vulnerability. His understanding that success without someone to share it with was just elaborate solitude, and maybe that was the real story all along. Not about deception or redemption. Not about falling in love or building unicorns. But about the distance between who we pretend to be and who we actually are, and how that distance shrinks when we finally find someone brave enough to see both versions and choose us anyway. The city lights came on one by one, marking the transition from day to night. Somewhere in this massive, indifferent metropolis, other people were making choices that would change their lives in ways they couldn't predict. Starting companies, ending relationships, taking risks, playing it safe. All of them navigating the impossible space between what they wanted and what they could control. Marcus thought about the question that had started everything. What do you do when the woman you hired to play your girlfriend becomes the only person capable of saving everything you've built? The answer, he'd learned, wasn't about salvation at all. It was about recognizing that what you built and who you love don't have to be in competition. That empires are just structures. But people, the messy, complicated, impossible people who see through your strategies and love you anyway, they're what make those structures matter. Elena squeezed his hand, bringing him back to the present. Where did you go just now? You had that look you get when you're solving problems in your head. Not solving, Marcus said. Just thinking about how we got here. All the decisions and accidents and choices that led to this moment. It's chaos pretending to be narrative. And yet here we are. And yet here we are. They kept walking. Two people who'd met through calculation and stayed through choice, navigating their shared life one uncertain step at a time. Behind them, the city continued its endless rhythm. Ahead, the future remained unwritten, which was terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. And between those two states, in the space where fear met hope, they built something that wasn't perfect, but was undeniably, irrevocably theirs. Sometimes the most important questions aren't the ones we can answer. They're the ones that teach us how to live with uncertainty, how to choose love over control, how to build empires and maintain humanity simultaneously. Marcus Chen had learned that lesson at great cost. But standing here, hand in hand with the woman who'd agreed to pretend and ended up making everything real, he wouldn't change a single calculated risk that had led him here, because in the end, the best things in life aren't the ones we plan for. They're the ones that find us when we're busy making other arrangements, the ones that force us to choose between the comfort of control and the chaos of genuine connection. And if we're lucky, if we're brave enough, we choose chaos, we choose truth, we choose each other. And that, more than any billion-dollar valuation or strategic victory, that's what it means to build something that lasts. Retry.